Welcome to the Manhattan Institute's Eventcast and Devolution. I'm Michael Hendrix, Director of State and Local Policy here at MI. Federalism is embedded in the US Constitution and has played a key role in American history. But since the Great Depression and World War II, power has become increasingly centralized in Washington, leaving state and local governments with less authority to provide local solutions to local problems. But does really America need a one-size-fits-all approach to its challenges? Does Texas need the same set of solutions that Vermont does, or vice versa? Do the policies work the same way in these jurisdictions? Well, to answer these questions and more, we're going to dive into the philosophy, practicality, and the policy of devolution as the solution in action. We also have a terrific panel to discuss and tackle these questions. Throughout our discussion, please enter your questions into whatever platform you're watching us on, and I'll incorporate them in as we go. All right, now first up, we have David French. He's the senior editor at The Dispatch and a columnist for Time Magazine. He's also, appropriately enough, for this conversation, the author of Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. We have Brian Riedl, a senior fellow here at the Manhattan Institute, dear colleague, and the author of the new report, which is giving us the basis for this discussion, Devolution, 4 proposals to empower states and reduce Washington's political strife. David, Brian, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. Brian, I want to turn to you to kick things off. What is devolution?
Thanks, Michael. Devolution simply means transferring more authority downward from the federal government down to state and local governments. The idea being that having 330 Americans fight to the death over the control of one-size-fits-all policies in Washington is too contentious, and it leads to worse policies. As mentioned, if Texas wants conservative policies, let them do it themselves. If Vermont wants liberal policies, let them do it. Ultimately, it's about better government, more choice, and more voters getting what they want.
Okay, so better government, more choice. I hear these arguments for you. I hear them out there all the time. So expound upon your argument for devolution and broadly federalism in your latest paper. We'll get more into the weeds shortly, but I really want you to dig into your argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of broad arguments for federalism that I talk about in my report. I mean, the primary argument is to stop the Washington Civil Wars. For instance, we've spent 30 years in a fight to the death over healthcare in Washington, D.C., with only 2 significant laws, Medicare Part D and Obamacare. We flipped Congress multiple times and had Supreme Court lawsuits over healthcare without a lot actually happening. So let's just let conservatives do free market approaches and let liberal states do single payer or whatever they want. Second, happier voters. Partisan sorting, which I know David has written about at length, means that some parts of the country are overwhelmingly liberal or conservative. Why don't let each of them get what they want in their own part of the country? There's also an argument for right-sizing government. California is the 4th largest economy in the world. Texas is the 9th largest economy in the world. How can we say they can't govern themselves and need Washington? I mean, isn't America too big for one size fits all? There's accountability. Local governments are closer to the voters. They can tailor local policies to local needs and can be replaced. You get more experimentation. If you have 50 states trying 50 different approaches on healthcare or education, you can try their own system and see what works. And the idea is that over time, the better policies will win out and be replicated across the country. So my report makes those general arguments, then it dives into how to do this in surface transportation, education, welfare, and healthcare, how to create federal block grants, how to make them accountable, how to set up minimum standards, all the weedy stuff to convert it into action.
Okay, Brian. David, I want to give you a chance to expound upon that, but first, give us some of the history. You've written in the past about the different phases of federalism and centralization and how they inform the system we have today and also maybe the system that we want in the future. So walk us through those phases.
Well, I think it's interesting how, I think even in a way, the choice of the term devolution, which I like, I also like other terms like localism, for example. our choices of these words are even a symbol of some of the problems we've had in the past. Because one of the problems that we've had in the past with federalism is that we've had the exact wrong kind of federalism. One of the things I talk about in my book is that we've had a federalism of the Bill of Rights. In other words, that, of course, the Bill of Rights originally applied only to Congress. It did not apply to the states. And so for many, many years, these sort of fundamental rights, this fundamental American social compact, your ability to access and to be a part of that fundamental American social compact depended a lot, not just on your race, but your location, where you were in the United States of America. And that's something that has given federalism and what people sometimes would just call states' rights a bad name, is that we have gone through a period in American history where federalism was used as a means and a mechanism of subjugating and oppressing multiple different classes of American citizens. And so when we're talking about federalism now, a lot of times, especially when you're talking to a more left-leaning audience, you have to fight through that past. You have to fight through that past. And you have to say, okay, wait a minute. No. What we are not talking about is states' rights in the 1958 sense of the term states' rights. We are wanting to preserve the nationalization of the Bill of Rights, so sort of the universal rights that accrue to all American citizens as articulated in the Bill of Rights. That needs to stay protected federally. But when we talk about localism or devolution now, in general, what we're talking about are things like what Brian just talked about, different approaches in healthcare, different approaches in environmental policy, different approaches in taxation, different approaches in economic policy. These are things that allow American citizens who live in states where one particular point of view tends to predominate to be able to enact the policies that express their values. A record number of states right now are what are called trifecta states. In other words, the one party holds the House, the upper chamber, the lower chamber, and the governor's mansion. Almost 80% of Americans live in states that have that kind of unified government. And yet their ability to enact policies in accordance with their values is limited by centralization. And so one of the ways past this winner take all, and which really turns out to, because of gridlock, to be winner take nothing, but feels like winner take all kind of national politics we have, is more localism. But it has to be a localism that sheds the baggage of that dreadful past, where it was a localism or a selectivity of the Bill of Rights.
And talk to us about theory versus practice, because I mean, obviously I'm biased, but I hear you, David, I hear you, Brian, and all of this sounds good. David, you've talked in theory before how we should let California be California, let Tennessee be Tennessee, but it's not always easy to make that happen, right?
Well, it's not easy at all. I think one of the problems is that we have become so polarized that we begin to look at a different policy in one state, even if we don't live in that state, as a defeat for our worldview. And one example, an example that we've been living with for more than a year, is the pandemic. In a way, this has been one of the great experiments of federalism of modern times. I mean, because of the way police power works in American law, it's the states, not the federal government. It's the states that have had the power to impose or lift lockdowns, to impose or lift mask mandates. And so we've had a patchwork of different approaches to the pandemic. In a nation that's less polarized, that would be a healthy approach where we could learn from each other. In a nation that's super polarized like this one, all of a sudden you have a whole bunch of people who live in California and New York who are really mad at Ron DeSantis, and a whole bunch of people who live in Florida who are really mad at California and New York, in part because every kind of dispute has become nationalized. So it feels like there has to be a sort of a two-step process here. One, we have to reach a mental state where we can say, look, it's okay if another state enacts a policy I disagree with. We have to get there. And right now we're at a position where people can be livid if they're living in Washington, if they're living in Seattle, about as far as you can get from, say, Tallahassee, and they can be livid about Ron DeSantis. And that's a situation where a polarization or mutual animosity has reached to such a degree that it causes even federalism at a point to become inflammatory, because we just can't abide one of our political opponents prevailing anywhere at any time.
Right. I mean, you noted how our past experience or recent experience with COVID is an example of federalism in action. And I could see somebody saying, well, isn't that an example of how it doesn't work? It certainly hasn't de-escalated our partisan fights today. It certainly hasn't seemed to, maybe they would argue it doesn't seem to have had an effect on COVID. But I hear you arguing that actually it's a sign of how we should be going even further down the devolution path. How the problems that we've had so far during COVID are more often instances of nationalization occurring, not of the federalism or devolution occurring.
Well, it's the nationalization of local disputes in many ways. So my view is there has to be a two-step process. Step one is we have to get at least weary enough of polarization that we can leave our fellow citizens alone in another state to do what they want to do. But then once you get to at least the point where you're willing to let Florida be Florida, that's when federalism can create a sustainable social peace, because it results in a de-escalation. It results in a focus on the local. But right now, where we are right now, we're so dysfunctional that we get unreasonably angry by the policies that don't impact our lives at all.
So I do want to step back and talk about the assumptions behind all of this. I think there's so much to tease out. But I think inevitably I start asking specifics. How would this work in practice? So Brian, I do want to come back to you. Let's zoom in on the practicalities of devolution, how it works. Give us examples of great policies that we really should be devolving to states and localities.
Sure. I mean, my report, obviously, we're not going to devolve, true national policies, defense, international relations, Federal Reserve, macroeconomic stabilization, civil rights have to be protected at all costs. My report focuses on 4 areas: surface transportation, K-12, education, welfare, and healthcare.
Okay, so you've identified 3 areas. How would then Washington go about devolving? We'll get to transportation because this is very timely. But how would they go about devolving K through 12 effectively?
Well, I mean, actually, I think K through 12. Let me think. Welfare, I think, is a better example right now, because K through 12, we've actually started devolving a little bit already. I think welfare is a good example. The current welfare system is a bureaucratic mess with no one in charge. We have 80 different means-tested programs that are spread across half a dozen federal departments and dozens of federal agencies. These programs are overseen by all different congressional committees. They're reauthorized in separate bills that are enacted years and decades apart from each other. So a result is all these federal welfare programs have wildly divergent eligibilities, benefit formulas, and requirements from their recipients. And even the programs interact with each other. Some of these programs block grant money to states, some rely on matching grants, others bypass states entirely. On top of this federal morass, this federal glump of programs, are these state programs with their own approaches. So you end up having this completely Byzantine welfare system with, again, dozens of programs that are all overseen by different committees, different agencies, different levels of government. They all interact with each other. And somehow this thing swallows $1.1 trillion a year, which is enough to give $100,000 to every family below 125% of the poverty line. But that's not what's happening, because the whole system's a mess. You feel bad for the families who have to navigate all these programs. So how would federalism work in practice? Simple. You combine all of these streams of federal money into one block grant to the states. And you say the block grant will grow annually by inflation and by poverty population. You require a degree of state matching funds, just like states put up their own funds. And then you mandate and this is important, you have to have some minimum federal mandates, especially when you're using federal dollars, to make sure states are actually using it how you want. So there should be some basic minimum standard of assistance or standard of income. You could work out a couple other minimums like poverty targets. Beyond that, you just have states combine their federal grant with their own state funds to build one coordinated system for people who are vulnerable. That way, when someone walks into a welfare office, instead of navigating a maze of programs, they enroll in one coordinated system that's tailored to them rather than 24 federal programs. I just think that would be so much easier. A New York welfare program can focus on housing assistance because it's really expensive there. Where I live in Washington, D.C., they could focus a lot on childcare costs where it's really expensive here. In Texas, you can focus on energy costs if they're rising, but you could tailor each system to local values and local needs and have one coordinated system rather than having dozens of federal and state programs and asking these poor families to navigate all of them. That's one example of how it can work in practice.
David, how does that sound to you?
I mean, to me, that sounds like the only reasonable way to do this. For a couple of reasons, and one that I think a lot of people overlook, and one that, again, the pandemic highlighted. States have limited fiscal power compared to the federal government. And so the federal government really was the only entity that had the fiscal power to come in at a time of extraordinary economic stress. And the way I try to describe the early response to the pandemic, as opposed to some of the continued trillions we're shoving into the system now, but the early response was more like sort of like disaster relief than say economic stimulus properly understood. The states never could have done that. The states never could have done that because they just didn't have the ability to tax that much, to go into that kind of deficit spending for an emergency. So when you have a federal system where the federal government has the fiscal power and the fiscal authority to deal with economic stress and economic crises in a way that state governments don't, I think the block grant system is the way you square that circle. It's the way you take advantage of the fiscal power of the federal government while maintaining the federalist variability of policy at the state and local level. So I think it's the way through this. And it's also the way through this kind of practical political objection that gets raised, which is, well, wait a minute, we have dedicated X number of resources to helping vulnerable populations in the United States. If you want to go to federalism, how are we moving to federalism without depriving these vulnerable populations of the very resources that the American people intended that they have? And that's the answer to that question. And states that do this well, not all of them will do it well, but states that do this well will actually deliver aid in a more targeted way, as Brian was saying, that's tailored to the needs of their particular population, and in all likelihood in a bit more efficient way, which is not a high bar to clear.
We have some excellent questions coming in, and one of the first questions is about the practicality. It seems like we have some excellent both test cases of the potential of devolution coming up, but also maybe some boundaries, some maybe even insurmountable boundaries to devolution. So one of the first questions is, look, we have a multi-trillion-dollar reconciliation bill being debated, a large chunk of which will go towards cementing federal control. This is the questioner's question. Large chunk of which will go to cementing federal control of health and human services. How do we roll that back? And Brian, we also have this infrastructure bill. You talk about highways in your paper. Does the infrastructure bill that we're debating make it more or less likely that devolution would happen? Or how would the devolution debate have changed our whole conversation in infrastructure?
Yeah, we're witnessing the increased centralization of infrastructure, which is traditionally a state and local policy. What's crazy is the federal government's trying to figure out how to pay for infrastructure when we just gave governors $350 billion for budget deficits that no longer exist. Wouldn't it have made more sense to have the governors use a one-time $350 billion windfall for what is traditionally a state and local function anyway, which is infrastructure? It seems like Congress purposely is going out of the way to shut out state and local governments out of infrastructure because they want to be seen as doing something, and they want the ribbon cutting, they want the credit, they want the power ultimately. And just to dive into this, the federal highway program is probably the easiest candidate for devolution to the states. In fact, it was originally intended to be devolved to the states when the highway program was created in the 1980s. Instead, right now, states already have their own gas tax. That's about 36 cents per gallon that they use to pay for their own surface transportation. But then states also collect an 18-cent per gallon federal gas tax that they send to Washington. Washington subtracts an administrative haircut and then sends the money right back to the states with all these strings attached telling them how to spend it. Why not just cut out the federal middleman and let states retain that 18-cent per gallon gas tax themselves? They're already doing the other 2/3, the 36. Why can't they do the 18? All you need to do is make sure that they still maintain their interstate highways, which, by the way, is a very small part of what the federal gas tax goes to anyway. Most of it goes to state roads. Just cut out the federal middleman and let mayors and city councils and state governments decide where to put a street light. There was a famous example that I wrote about a couple of years ago where congressional legislation was deciding which intersections to put a street light at. What's the point of having local governments if Congress is going to do that? And I think that the purpose is, there was an urge of people in Congress. They want to be the heroes. They want the power. They want the authority. They want the ribbon cuttings. They want to be seen as problem solvers, and pushing it off and saying this is why you have governors and mayors isn't necessarily in their nature, unfortunately.
Right. And so David, if you're talking to a member of a congressional office and they're looking at an infrastructure bill, they're looking at reconciliation on the horizon, and maybe they're agreeing with you on devolution generally, but specifically they have these bills in front of them, and we're kind of debating the particular merits of the bill and what the federal government should be investing in. How do you get them to zoom back out and say, is this even a proper role for the federal government? Should we going in a completely different direction? How do you do that?
Well, I mean, I think you have to pursue two tracks at once. As one, you have to be talking to legislators in the macro sense of okay, here's what you guys should be. Here are the block grant type approaches that Brian was just talking about that are preferable, and educating legislators and trying to adjust their frame. Then when you have an actual bill in front of you, though, it gets a lot harder. They have to vote yes or no on it, up or down on it. And then the question is, in what way can you nudge it in positive directions? Are there amendments that you can offer? Are there changes that you can propose that would nudge it in one way that's better or worse? Can we add an element of block grants to it? Can we change it in such a way that it's moving at least in some direction? But I think you cannot neglect sort of the macro philosophical argument, and you have to make it consistently, and you have to make it over time, because we've got a lot of educating that we have to do with not just the legislators, but the American public. Because the fact of the matter is, for a lot of rational reasons, the American public just doesn't participate locally as much as they participate in federal elections. And so if you're telling them to focus more locally, you're asking them to change their own habits. Now, some of that is changing a little bit on some of the education debates we're having now about, masking in schools, or, teaching of critical race theory or similar concepts. And so we are seeing some more local engagement there. But as a general matter, for the average voter, it's going to take time to say, hey, Washington shouldn't be your focus. And so you've got this double educational challenge ahead of you. And it takes leadership, it takes persuasion, it takes vision, all of the things that are in abundant supply in the American political class right now.
Brian, you talk with congressional offices all the time. How does that sound to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to make the case. The funny thing is about if you look at members of Congress, again, let's look at highway devolution. I mean, it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. President Reagan's commission in 1980, after the highway program ended, recommended devolving. Interestingly, there have been bills to devolve the highway program to the states since the early 90s. And as a matter of fact, in 2014, a majority of Republican senators voted for an amendment to turn back the highway program to the states. What ends up happening is a lot of the senators come into Congress supporting devolution and federalism. They write bills, they talk about it, they vote for it, and then they become committee chairmen. And as soon as they become committee chairmen, the same lawmakers who are writing bills to devolve are suddenly leading the fight against it. Because now you're the person dispersing the money. You're the person who's raising tons of money from lobbyists who are interested in the issue. You're the one sending money back to your home state. You're getting all the benefits and perks, and now you don't believe in it so much anymore. And that's why I think the push for devolution really has to come from the ground up. The governors who want this need to be more aggressive. State legislators and mayors need to be more aggressive. Voters need to be more aggressive. And it's interesting that, David is right that voters don't engage much with local governments. But the interesting thing is, polls show voters prefer local control on most of these issues. If you just ask them, should your governor or Congress have more control? Polls on most of the issues we've talked about say, I would rather my governor have control. But the governors and the newer lawmakers have to be more aggressive pushing for this, because the people who hold the power right now aren't going to. And I have to say, I'm a little disappointed in governors, because like in the 90s, governors were really aggressive. Like they wanted Medicaid block grants and devolution. Not so much now. A lot of them, they get such big matching funds from Medicaid, they don't talk much about devolution. And another example is a decade ago, we created Obamacare. 26 states didn't even set up their own Obamacare exchange. They jumped into the federal exchange. So governors are kind of becoming a little less aggressive, even demanding it, which is disappointing.
Right. It's funny. You hear about this too, about, people like Yuval Levin and others arguing that Congress should really be more protective of its own powers. Instead, you see Congress willingly giving up power to the executive branch because it's often politically convenient. I was going to wait for this question, but I think it's a great time now. I mean, as you said, Brian, all of this sounds great. Blue America gets blue policies. Red America gets red policies. Mm-hmm. Polling says it's popular. So then the question is, why don't we get more devolution? I think this gets to a question that I want to point to you, Brian, is like, why would Congress agree to seemingly reduce its own power? Why would a committee chair want to do this?
That's the question. I think it takes a different approach to their job. I mean, right now, again, members of Congress often see their job as collecting power, collecting fundraising, which is a big part of it. The more you have jurisdiction over, the more you can fundraise. And they see their job as getting in the newspaper and raising a lot of money. And it takes changing the way they approach their job. I think I tell members of Congress, it's better to do a few things well than a lot of things poorly. That doesn't go over very well when I talk to them that way. But, I mean, you think of things like, are the true things we should be focusing on in Congress: defense, international relations, true macroeconomic stabilization, homeland security. What if we could just focus on those and do better? But again, if I had an explanation for how to really convince Congress, I would have made it and been successful.
Right. I mean, Brian, it almost seems like this is a question also from the audience too. I mean, maybe it should be flipped on the head. Like, this is what you and Congress can gain from devolution. There is potentially some upside. I don't know if that's clearly articulated to them, but maybe there is. There's 2 points I want to bring up with you, David, partly because I'm just curious. One is Brian was talking. I want to get to states and localities and why they would want devolution.
Mm-hmm.
But first, Brian talked about how we should leave certain things to the federal government, which makes sense if you look at the Constitution: defense, international affairs, money printing, macroeconomic stabilization, major regulations. But I look at all those things and I think, well, if all of that stays with the federal government, do we ever practically get devolution? I look at major moments of nationalization and it's moments of war, financial crises. So if all the mechanisms by which we've gotten nationalization over time occur, it still stays with the federal government. Again, why do we get devolution?
Well, there's so many ways. In the ways in which government actually touches and impacts people, devolution is still incredibly viable. I mean, you think about the things where we have to have the federal government involved, national defense. That is not something that, except for weeks like this week, that on a daily basis touches American lives in the way it does, say, the lives of service members themselves. Or if you're talking about diplomacy, that is something that is far removed from people's everyday lives. What is right there? What is right up in front of them? It's the road that they're driving on to work, which only a minority of those are interstate highways. It is the air that they're breathing in their immediate environment, which is highly dependent on local factors. It is the school that they are taking their kid to. It is the condition of the healthcare infrastructure in the state that they live in. All of those things, each one of those things can be directly and primarily influenced by local authorities, and to a large degree already are, but could be more. And so the ways in which government works, in the ways in which we touch government, and the way we experience government in a tangible way, the majority of that is still, and can be, and actually is to a large degree, local. And the problem that we have is that these local ways that government has impacted our lives are increasingly being federalized. And to go back to something that we were talking about earlier about what are the incentives here for Congress? Well, for a few generations now, the main incentive for Congress has been to punt its authority. And now, where have they punted it? They've punted it to the presidency. That's where they've punted it. So my colleague Jonah Goldberg has a great phrase that he uses to describe Congress. It's a parliament of pundits. Mm-hmm. And so, what you have is a double incentive, a couple of incentives. One, to punt authority, and the other one to pontificate about how that authority is exercised by the person you punted it to. It's like punting the football and then immediately running to the booth to commentate on the punt return. I mean, that's essentially the way things are happening now. And so convincing Congress to punt isn't that hard. Convincing them to punt it in the right direction, that's what's been proven difficult. And that's a real key question that I don't have the perfect answer for in any way, shape, or form. Congress has been sort of a trigger phrase for me is I hate the phrase co-equal branches of government, because I don't believe that the founders intended them to be co-equal. Congress has the power to fire the president. Congress can fire any member of the Supreme Court. Congress is checked by other branches, but it is more powerful than other branches in theory. But now it has become voluntarily the least powerful branch. So, perhaps one of our big goals should be to convince the congressional punter to turn around and punt in a whole different direction.
I love cynical optimism. I really like that. Okay, the other thing I really wanted to get to, and this is a question also from the audience, was on the states and localities. What are their incentives? David, this is to you first. I think on the one hand, what governor or mayor wouldn't want power punted to them, more money punted to them, right?
A lot of them.
But of course, on the other hand, how much more convenient is it to run for office as mayor based on who's in the White House versus how effectively you've picked up the garbage, right? Like then you don't have to run on how effective you are as a mayor or governor. It just matters who's in the White House. Or I know so many instances of governors who, in tough economic times, or mayors, absolutely willing to cut park budgets, absolutely willing to cut the basics of what they do, but heaven help it if they cut the free money of Medicare, or cut the free money. They're just, their political opponents will say, you're just leaving money on the table. So they'll cut the stuff that they have direct control over, but gladly take federal money. Or, the last one, look at the infrastructure bill that we're debating. It goes on and on and on about federal and state partnerships. And so, in that instance, both can take credit, and who doesn't love to take credit for free stuff? So David, how do you approach the incentives in states and localities here to get them to also buy into devolution?
That's a really good question. And one of the negative trends we've had from that perspective is it's been since George W. Bush that we've had a governor move to the presidency. So that sort of path to the presidency that says, I'm going to become president by being the best, having the best story to tell about how I ran my state, has sort of, that path is narrowed. We've had a senator, we've had a celebrity, and then we've had another senator. And so that's been the path, senator and vice president, and that's certainly not local authority and control. And so, it could very well be the case. One positive outcome from the pandemic controversies, to find a silver lining in a very dark cloud, is it's quite possible that in the GOP primary, we might have some governors running based on competing records in this time of crisis. And if we could reestablish a path to the presidency that runs through governing your state well, that's a sort of a very basic way of changing incentives. And I think that a path to the presidency that runs more through the Senate is a terrible trend, because that then puts the premium on being a pundit again, because any given senator doesn't have the ability to impact the course of the nation all that much, although they can certainly podcast, and they can certainly, get on Fox and get on MSNBC. So I would like to see a return to a presidential primary race dominated by governors arguing about who is the best governor. And I think that could be at least somewhat positive. And I do think that might be quite possible in 2024.
Brian, I wonder about your take. Maybe we've been seeing fewer instances of governors becoming presidents, but we have recent instances of a mayor becoming DOT secretary. How do you view the incentives here for states and localities, Brian?
Yeah, I agree with what David is saying. I think, back when I was first becoming politically active in the 80s and 90s, governors were the centers of innovation, and they saw that as a path to the presidency. I worked for Governor Tommy Thompson of Wisconsin in 1996 when he was, or 1995, and when he was implementing the Wisconsin Works welfare reforms that became the national model for national welfare reform. So, I kind of came of age in the golden age of state capitals and innovative governors. You had John Engler next door in Michigan was doing great things. You had all these great governors who were being really innovative, and they saw that as a path to the presidency. But these days, you look at Medicaid, for instance, there are governors that get matching rates as high as $9 in federal funds for every $1 they spend. They're fat and happy the way they are. The federal government is just kind of, in some areas, giving them a lot of money as matching funds, and not really doing it in a structured, devolved way. But a lot of the governors are kind of fat and happy right now, and so they don't really have much of an incentive to push for it. Additionally, I just want to mention on the healthcare thing, even Canada, which is, as far left as can be on healthcare, doesn't do an open-ended matching fund system like we do. They do a per capita block grant to each of the provinces with a requirement that you basically do a certain degree of national health care. Even Canada doesn't do it like we do with the open-ended block grant. But I would love to see governors take more ownership, and whether they're motivated by running for the presidency or just bettering their state. Right now, a lot of them just seem kind of happy to get big checks from Washington without being really expected to do too much. And also, a lot of them, as David mentioned, a lot of governors are happy to nationalize anger. and kind of run against Washington. There was a lot of governors in 2018, Democratic governors, who basically got elected running against Trump in 2018, not running against their Republican opponent, but they're happy to push all the anger up to Washington and then kind of make themselves heroic individuals on the outside who will just kind of support your values in the grand fight for Washington, which is not even remotely what the founders intended. But that's the sort of kind of Fox News, MSNBC PR approach. Unfortunately, we end up kind of incentivizing with governors at the state level. And those who are ambitious seem to be riding that train to national prominence rather than look at all the problems I fixed in my state.
Okay, so this brings up just one more cynical, negative question that gives you all a chance to be optimists here.
Only one more. We have room for a lot more cynicism.
So much room for that. Okay, one more though. David, I'll punt this to you, but Brian, you can also jump in. So I can imagine hearing someone hear all this and say, well, all that's great, but isn't the left devoted to federal maximalism such that devolution is only possible with their outright capitulation? At which point, then devolution also just becomes yet another partisan fight and another cultural war thing. So that point on what about whether the left? How do you approach that?
I don't approach the left as a monolith any longer. I do absolutely agree. Particularly the more socialist the left gets, the more national its ambitions are. I also have talked to, let me put it this way. I had a conversation in 2019, very smart guy on the left, impeccable Democratic credentials. And after a few years of the Trump administration said, I have now begun to really understand the virtues of federalism. And I was, welcome aboard, welcome aboard. I do think there is disagreement on this point, and I do think there is an increased emphasis on what localities can do. I'll give you another example. I was listening to Ezra Klein's podcast talking about the problem of NIMBYism, for example, in housing policy. And why is it that some of the most progressive communities in the United States are the hardest for poor or lower income Americans to live in? They just can't buy into the place at all. They're wall. It's like they're walled out. Like there's a wall and a moat. And
they built the wall.
Yeah. And the person Ezra was talking to, super smart person, talking about housing policy and was talking about national. And Ezra goes, we can't avoid the local. You can't avoid it. And so I think there are a lot of smart people who are beginning to see some of the problems that we have that we had thought nationally about for a long time and realize that the local is just unavoidable. I'll give you another arena where something like this has become very viable. Mass incarceration, prison reform. Aside from the First Step Act, which is relatively modest, that's why it's called First Step, almost all of the interesting action on prison reform has happened in left-right coalitions at the state level. So the more that this occurs, I think the more that there is an opportunity to form coalitions. One thing that we're learning is that in this present day and age of realignments, you cannot speak of the right as an ideological monolith any longer. You cannot speak of the left, I don't think, as an ideological monolith. And so finding like-minded individuals to work with on local issues reinforces localism by habit and practice.
Right. And David, haven't you written before on, and Brent, but I'll get to you, but you've written before how there's incentives for right and left. So look at the partisan fears of the majority and the minority and what they might do with power or sway, where you can say devolution is not actually partisan. Whatever their priors are in the size of government, both sides can have a reason to support devolution.
Well, both sides have a fear, and it's a different fear. Okay. If you were going to talk to somebody on the left and you'd say, what is your sort of dystopian fear for the American future? And they'll say minoritarian control. So they'll say that through the quirks of the American electoral system and the electoral college and the Senate, et cetera, There's a scenario in which Republicans could build an enduring minority, a enduring governing coalition that represents a minority of Americans. Flip it around with Republicans. A lot of smart Republicans are going to say, I fear majoritarian tyranny. In other words, it might be a 51-49 country or 51.5, 48.5. But if we have a world in which 51% wins gives you 100% of the power, then we will be run roughshod over. So one of the great things about localism as a concept, about devolution as a concept, is it can deal with both fears. And it's a way to address both fears. And both fears are quite real amongst very smart people on the right and the left.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think to echo a few points, I think when I talk to my left of center friends on devolution, I think one point that I remind and that I think of is, well, first off, on a political point, President Trump should be a motivator for federalism for a lot of people on the left who spent 4 years absolutely terrified of the impact the American president can have over their lives. And you have to look no further than the fact that in 2017, there was a Cal exit movement where there was a California Democrats were talking about seceding from the country. And at its peak, 44% of California Democrats told pollsters, whether or not this is legitimate or whether they really believed it, 44% of Democrats in California told pollsters they supported Cal exit to get away from the impact of Donald Trump. And so one thing, if they can dream about all these wonderful things a Democratic president can do for the whole country, the flip side is look at all the things a Republican president that you oppose can do to the country that you don't have any say over. On the policy level, I also remind Democratic friends that how much they rebelled against No Child Left Behind as a federal overreach and a federal micromanagement on the right, which led to Democrats voting overwhelmingly to repeal No Child Left Behind in 2015. So again, you have this danger that conservative presidents can implement policies you don't like just as much as liberal presidents can implement policies you do like. And that reminds me of, I just want to echo a fabulous point that David made earlier about, I'm not sure the divide is as much left and right as it is political activists often are the people, and ideologues are the people who usually most oppose federalism. And that's because when I talk to more ideological people, the problem is not left or right. It's that they're not willing to give up their dream of full national control. I mean, with federalism, your side gets to have your policies in your state, but you have to let the other side implement their policies in their states. And these ideologues are so convinced of the superiority of their views that their one wave election from imposing their vision from sea to signing C, you get it, that they cannot even bear the thought of letting the other half of the country live under those awful policies, even if they want to. Therefore, I think with devolution, the issue isn't liberal or conservative, it's humility and tolerance and accepting that other parts of the country may choose a different path than you. But I'll just add to that point, though, I also consider devolution dynamic and confident. While it's humble, it's also dynamic and confident, because what you're saying is, I want my view to be implemented in a couple states, and I'm willing to let their views be implemented in other states, and let's see who wins. Let's stop debating in Washington for 30 years about healthcare. Fine. You do your policy, we'll do mine, and I'm confident enough that my state will do better and other states will copy. So I think while devolution requires humility, it also actually requires confidence that when the rubber meets the road, your approach isn't going to fall flat on its face.
This almost sounds like a difference between helicopter parenting and free range parenting. We have a little too much helicopter parenting today with the federal government, a little more free range. If a state's going to make mistakes, we'll let them learn from the mistakes. The mark of Illinois is no mark on Indiana. But one thing that you touched on, where I'm going to break my promise of that being the last negative question. I'm going to have one more. So someone asked in the audience about New York and how devolution sounds great, but have you met Albany legislators? If you're an upstate, you've constantly dwelt on, if you're at all tuned into politics, constantly dwelt on the power of downstate New York City and how downstate loves running roughshod over upstate. And so, New York is a big state. Maybe we need two states. Or just to reframe it again, devolution sounds great if you are thinking in your mind about the reasoned discourse of a New England town meeting as described by Tocqueville. But have you ever witnessed a zoning hearing in San Francisco or a school board meeting on masks in Williamson County, Tennessee? I mean, states and localities are rife with problems of their own, right, David?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you have the same problem, I think, when you're advocating for devolution that you have when you're advocating for pluralism, and that is, it's not utopian. Okay, one of the things, the argument for federalism, this is not a utopian vision. When you watch things like the mask hearing that happened in Williamson County that trended nationally because some people were threatening healthcare workers who are pro-mask, is you realize that, look, politics is problematic everywhere. And we're not saying, okay, we're going from dysfunctional Washington to the platonic form of politics in Williamson County. No. But what I will say is if I don't like the politics in Williamson County, I have a lot greater ability to change them than I do the politics in Washington, D.C. That's really the key difference. So, if I'm embarrassed, as I was, by the behavior of neighbors in that hearing, look, there's good faith disagreements to be had about masking in public schools, but threatening healthcare workers, seriously? So, but if I have a disagreement, I have a lot greater capacity to mobilize a countering force, to mobilize a force that says, at the very least, we're going to have this disagreement with decency. And so I think that that's one of the big differences. Your capacity to affect change in a way that empowers you and your fellow citizens is so much greater at the local level. This isn't a utopian vision, but it is an empowering vision. And that's a difference. And, the other thing that I would note about this, and as you look at this sort of issue of division and contention in the United States, here's another advantage of local control. When you really get involved, it can be really quite humbling if you get involved in good faith, because all of the things that seem so obvious to you and so easy to you as to how to deal with everything, when you're actually in a decision-making capacity, or you're actually working with those who are in decision-making capacities, gets more complicated really quickly. I mean, I spent years as being on the school board of my kid's school, and we could talk in good faith for 6 hours about a minor policy change in a disciplinary policy. It's a humbling thing to engage in a way that's constructive, because you can begin to realize the complexity of our issues. And again, that points back towards the authority and the putting the authority and responsibility on the people who understand the problem the most and experience it in the most intimately, as opposed to the people the furthest from it.
Yeah, and we can still say we need a healthier civic culture. We need better institutions, including at the state and local level. But it also seems, at least from my vantage point, a little easier to wrap my mind around if you're thinking about how you can change the civic culture in your community of 50,000 people than like pontificating on how we need to change America's entire civic culture or build institutions nationally.
And believe you me, there has been a local backlash to that hostility and that what trended nationally. There are a lot of people who are very angry that that is the way Williamson County, Tennessee, a lovely county, it's where I live, was portrayed to the entire United States of America. And I think there's more ability of that local population to respond to that national embarrassment.
And Brian, I imagine we can also do more to build the capacity of states and localities too. I mean, just the competency, the talent there. I mean, there's, I know how, like, if you're really into politics and policy, often the thought is, oh, I'm going to go to DC and work in Capitol Hill. But there's also 50 states with state capitals and a lot of authority too, and maybe they can have more. And certainly there's more that we can be doing at that level to build up those institutions, right?
Sure. I mean, well, first I'll say while Washington D.C. is supposed to be the major leagues, Washington D.C. also gets a lot wrong and screws up a lot. So I'm not necessarily. I think it's unfair to even call Washington D.C. the major leagues and states the minor leagues after having seen Obamacare not be able to build a website. After what we've seen, I think with our foreign policy decisions in Afghanistan lately.
And
But
Brian, how many elected members of Congress have been in Congress, were in Congress when it last passed a budget?
Oh yeah, I mean it's been years and years. I mean, there's so much waste, there's so much inefficiencies. They can't our agencies can't even pass an audit. That being said, this would be a change for state and local governments. Most state governments right now are part-time legislatures. They pay very small salaries. They pay part-time salaries. Many of them only meet 2 to 3 months a year. Obviously, if states are going to become more powerful, they're going to need a lot of them to move to full-time and use full-time salaries and attract the kind of people who are willing to work at that. But ultimately, if the authority goes that direction, you're going to find more people wanting to go that direction. I mean, there's a chicken and egg issue. Part of the reason people dream of going to Washington is because Washington's making all the decisions. If the action is in state government, actually, I mean, I used to work in state government. I got my start at the Wisconsin State Capitol, as I mentioned earlier. I enjoyed it a lot because you could actually get things enacted. You could actually come up with an idea and pass it, unlike in Washington, where you spend 20 years advocating for the littlest change that never goes anywhere. And so I think you are going to need changes in how state and local governments function in terms of resources full time. But I also think there's a lot of opportunity to do big things. And like I said, you can overhaul issues that you could never overhaul in Washington. And for those of us who really like to roll up our sleeves and fix things in government and make things better, it's a great opportunity.
David, how would you kind of summarize your approach to devolution? I mean, would it be fair to point to the problems of polarization and say, here's an antidote?
Here's how I put it. It is the sustainable solution after the short-term antidote. Because I think that when we hate each other as much as we do right now, we end up nationalizing everything. So any local dispute, a kid gets a MAGA hat knocked off his head in a Burger King in Des Moines, and it trends, nationally on Twitter. So we're so full of rage at each other that in a weird way, even federalism fuels the rage because we can't stand that Florida's doing something we don't like or that California. So we have to be able to turn down the temperature just a notch or two. Then what federalism does, I think, in my view, is makes that temperature change sustainable by de-escalating national politics. But we got to be able to turn down the temperature a little bit, perhaps because we have a exhausted majority in the United States of America who's kind of sick of the way things are right now. And as long as that operative word in exhausted majority is exhausted and not majority, we got a problem. But when the majority wakes up, then we start to have a solution.
Brian, what's your elevator pitch for devolution?
Oh, elevator pitch. We're the third. We have 330 million Americans. We're the third most in the world. We cover one ocean to the other. We don't need one size fits all government from Hawaii all the way to Maine. We don't need a federal government that's telling us Washington shouldn't be deciding which roads to pave, which community centers to rebuild, what a teacher in this district should teach. Washington should not be setting the price of kidney dialysis in Wichita. I just think we can dial down the rage and make things better by letting conservative states be conservative and liberal states be liberal.
Thank you both for this excellent conversation. And thanks to our audience for tuning in. Please subscribe to MI, to the Dispatch, to stay in touch with our whole panel. There's much more to come. And with that, thank you both so much.